Yeah, yeah.
Good, good. I don't see your face. Put on your video
Okay,
too.
the thing is just there's a mask
Okay,
on
okay, fine.
the thing. Not in great shape.
Oh, okay, okay. You're not like that judge who got a request from a lawyer with a cat mask in the US,
Not yet.
and that was went viral across the internet.
We've all seen that. Yeah.
Okay, we are live now on YouTube.
Mr. Rapporteur.
Yeah. I think we should start, shouldn't we?
I'm very sorry. I've got stuck in the.
Hi, hi, Anand.
Oh,
Arnold Grover has joined us.
All in a good cause.
No, he's been doing some excellent work. He and Indra have been bailing out people who have been imprisoned completely wrongly, young student activists, and that's hats off to the work that they've been doing. Imprisoned completely wrongly, young student activists, and hats off to the work that they've been doing. Yeah. Completely wrongly, young student activists, and hats off to the work that they've been doing. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, we are now live on YouTube. We are live on YouTube, and we are recording. Okay,
thank you. Should John, do you think we should start, or should I wait for a few more minutes?
It's your show.
I have 11 participants. I now have all the panelists. I have one of your invitees.
I think you should start.
My invitees, yeah.
I think you should start,
I think we should start. Otherwise, it'll.
Yeah.
Hi, Anand.
hi, Mohan. How are you?
Good, how are you? Good to see you.
Likewise.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone in India. Good morning in Australia. At the moment, we haven't got friends from there as yet. And somewhere midday for friends in Europe. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center is very privileged to host this webinar this afternoon. After the problem that arose on the 8th of this month, we had to go to a much more secure platform, which is this. And also we could do so only with the help of Dr. Mohan and his Center for Legal Change, which have facilitated this new platform for our webinar. And so I need to thank him doubly, once for accepting to be a panelist, and two for coming to my rescue when I was at sea in terms of the technicalities of doing this again on another platform. It's really good to read the book. I got a copy of the book. After customs made me run around for some time, because obviously they don't like human rights books or any books per se. And so after giving me a runaround, I finally had the book delivered. And it really was a read. It really was a read because I'm quite familiar with the Commission on Human Rights, having attended every year without exception from 1992 to 2006. I attended the first meeting of the council and then decided that that was not my cup of tea. And also secondly, that I could use extranet to listen to it. And thirdly, that the government of India started in a big way. So bingo. And so the Human Rights Council really is not something that apart from my reading, had a physical presence apart from his first meeting. I need to mention a special word of thanks by way of introduction to John Pache. Apart from writing this fabulous book, at a personal level, I need to thank him. In 1993, at the World Conference on Human Rights, I had a problem. I was not being registered as South Asian Human Rights Documentation Center, thanks to the opposition of you know who. And there was a certain Indian diplomat at the UN then on a second, whose name I shall mention, but her political affiliations are now very clear because she's been one of the signatories amongst the Indian diplomats who signed missive to the Canadian Prime Minister saying, please do not interfere in.
You're breaking up, you know.
Can't hear you.
I think he's gone off. The rest of us can hear each other.
Yes.
He's probably gone off. He'll come back. He'll come back. No, he's still on. He's still on.
It's in the UN.
Yeah.
Still on, but can you hear me?
We lost you in
Can
the
you hear
middle
me
for
now?
about. We lost you for about 3 minutes. We lost you for about.
Basically, this Indian diplomat who has now decided to sign a missive to the Canadian Prime Minister not to interfere in India's affairs with a few others, attempted to block my registration. I went to John, whom I did not know at that point of time. It was just my second year at the commission, saying that I was a good guy, and I took a sheaf of papers to prove I was a good guy. And John had me admitted. The story doesn't end here. I'll just conclude with one line here. 2 weeks later, before going to the actual Vienna meeting, the foreign secretary invited me for a meeting. So I took Swami Abhivesh and Ratna Kapoor, who's a feminist lawyer, with me. And he said, how did you get in finally? Meaning that he had instigated the attempt to block my presence. So I told him, well, you're not the only one who has friends. I do have them too in different places. And that we decided to become friends after that. It's a pity that he died when he was not far into the job of the National Security Advisor. He was a major, great leap forward amongst the people who followed him. But the book, coming back to the book, it clearly is new and important because the governments over the years have tried to reduce the role of civil society. And John very clearly, again and again, emphasizes how important this role of civil society is. And this attempt at reduction of the role of civil society continues manifold in the new Human Rights Council. Not so very new, but definitely manifold. Secondly, something that has always been a gripe for NGOs, for the Secretariat of the High Commissioner's Office, for the Commission on Human Rights and the subcommission, was the budgetary constraints. In fact, many years ago, I'm talking about around 2006, I heard from a senior Ford Foundation official that the was equivalent to the budget of the UN for human rights. This was in the year 2006, and it may have increased by then because they've started a lot of other initiatives which are there. For many procedures could not be set up only because there wasn't adequate funding from the system, because there was clearly not a felt necessity for this. But it's not only the felt necessity of the UN system, it's also how the states operate. Because I was one of the key actors in the Bangkok meeting. In fact, I was the South Asian representative on the Asia Pacific NGO facilitating team, which came with the Bangkok NGO declaration. I could see how the Asian gang, and I will call them nothing less than that, of governments, in cahoots with some wonderful worthies like Syria, then Cuba, of course, our good neighbor Pakistan, our other good neighbor China, and at that point Indonesia, which was under Suharto, tried to do a football tackle on anything going forward on the human rights agenda. The major issue that was brought by civil society from Bangkok, and thanks to the UN system also went up to New York, was the whole issue of the Asian values debate being put on the back burner, getting short shrift by the NGO, Asian NGO Declaration of Bangkok. And I must thank John for referring to it in the book, but not just in the book, in a number of other articles that he's written elsewhere. Because it marked the coming of age of Asian NGOs. And this is where John's latest suggestion in the book and elsewhere about creating a regional grouping of NGOs as something subsidiary to the work of the Human Rights Council is very, very welcome. We saw how much import it had for us in our interventions in Vienna, because I am not boastful, but we were the best organized in Vienna, from accommodation to speaking time to the kind of notes that we made, and there was no single prima donnas. Everything was decided well in advance of who would we make on behalf of the team, what statement. And that was a major reason for our success. The old issues of the daily newspaper that was brought out in Vienna would attest to our effectiveness, and the number of governmental delegations that sought appointments with us to have a meet on different issues agitating governments during the Vienna conference. John again points out that the role of governments is not what it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. There's a new actor on the block, which is the corporate sector. The corporate sector now is extremely powerful and is involved in doing some good for human rights and some terrible things for human rights. And while Kofi Anand had talked about the Global Compact, obviously it did not go very far, and we still see a situation like where the High Court in the Supreme Court in the UK has taken a very advanced, very welcome step on the issue of the oil spills in Nigeria, and this is very very welcome. The speaking time in the UPR for civil society was always a problem. But now with COVID, if you look at the agenda for the March 21 session, it's clear that it's even further truncated, and the number of participants and the manner of participation is clearly problematic. So this is something that NGOs need to take a much more thing, and friendly governments need to put in their voices on this. I have quite a big shopping list. I won't go on and on. I perhaps will use some of my shopping list at the very end when I do the conclusion. But I would like to make one suggestion, which John does also and has explicitly done in an article elsewhere, where there must be some discussion on the veto power of these permanent members of the Security Council on human rights and humanitarian law issues. There must be some discussion, because they can't be blocking any advancement on the human rights agenda in the most powerful body of the UN system. I will let him speak on other issues which I have not touched upon. As I told you, I have the shopping list that I prepared after reading both the book and his various articles, and they were a delight. And I've already circulated many of the articles and the chapters of the book that OUP kindly gave me in advance, as well as the panelists who have the full book. I must also thank OUP for this great initiative before I conclude, because this is the first actual record of the Commission since its inception. I have all the summary records. I have the attendance list. My colleagues, why are you keeping all this junk? You don't dip into it except once a year. Why do you keep all this paper? I think now I may not need it, thanks to the fact that John has delved deep into it and put it all together in one book, and that compendium will be now the book that I shall dip into, instead of looking for tons of summary records of the various commissions. I'll conclude here. Thank you very much to John for agreeing to this, and it's been a delight to have this. I have not mentioned that you did lots of brilliant missions for the UN in Lebanon, Indonesia, tons of other countries which I don't even recall immediately. But you've clearly been a beacon, and you continue to train a whole range of young activists, most principally by this wonderful Australian program, the Diplomacy Training Program, which operates out of the University of New South Wales Law Faculty, and has meetings all over the country. I organized 2 or 3 in the early 2000s, but after that the government made a block on all meetings, just not mine, but every other meeting. So there have been meetings in Sri Lanka, and there have been meetings in Nepal, but we in India, it's a question of the Indian bureaucratic saying, apply, no reply. That's what, so we haven't been able to get a meeting in there. But John's been great with young people joining this. And as he says in the book itself, that this was the book emanated out of an interaction with young people who clearly did not have an overall picture of what the Commission meant and what an important role it played to advance the international human rights agenda and put the spotlight on some of the creepy crawly governments. Thank you very much. Having said that, I will now invite John to tell us about the book and also some of the key issues that he's touched upon there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's very, very moving, Ravi. I am very rarely at a loss for words, and this is one of them. You are very, very kind, and I very deeply appreciate it. I wish I were what you described. My colleagues, Gudmundur and Osamu, are participating, and I'm sure that as you were speaking, quite a few memories must have gone through their minds. We were a team, really, and I think we had one of the common features was our pragmatism, and living working in a world of rhetoric and hype. You realize the need to keep your feet on the ground and to take account seriously of those who are standing on it, i.e. the common person. I will briefly describe the book, and later, if it's okay with you, I'd like to give a short presentation on the issue of accountability and sovereignty, if that's
Please.
okay with you procedurally.
Please.
Thank you. The book. Well, after what I heard from Ravi, I am hesitant, but I have a note here to recall that throughout the existence of the Commission on Human Rights between 1946 and 2006, 2 states were members of that body without interruption. And one of them was India. The other one, Soviet Union, who, as you know, changed to the Russian Federation in 1991. And to complete the record, ever since the Council was set up in 2006, India was a member of the Council except in 2010 and 2018. So if there is a state, a country rather, that has an institutional memory, certainly it's the government of India. And I say that seriously and with respect. As I went through the research for the book, India came up constantly. The role played cannot be overestimated rather, especially the personalities involved both in government and out of government. And I hope that in the second edition, I will add Ravi Naidu to the collection of famous Indian colleagues. Now, the purpose of the book was actually to furnish a complete record of everything that the Commission and the Council took up since 1946. And because I realized that as I was teaching, students were missing, there is somebody who was trying to get in, or somebody who was hammering to get out of somewhere. Yeah. I don't know what it is, but I promise it's not me.
I think Ravi, do you have some work going on since you just moved? Do you have some work going on?
No, in my neighbor's house.
Oh, okay. It doesn't bother me. It might bother you.
You might want to mute. We may all want to mute our mics except the speaker.
Yeah, sure. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Now I'm hammering.
John needs to unmute.
I'm unmuted now. As I was giving this course, it was in Nepal, and it was just outside Kathmandu. It was a group of 35 young NGOs from South Asia and Southeast Asia, mostly. And they were impressive in their practical knowledge, and also very impressive in the need that they had to apply their practical knowledge to the international standards and the developments at the international level. So I had applied a little sort of trick I had of giving students what I called quick crons. 1 page, 10 lines, and you have the evolution of the declaration, another one, the treaty, and so on. So I said, why don't we try to create an omnibus thing? And that is why the book was developed. So in order to do that, of course, I was faced with 2 main challenges. One, of course, was the volume. The manuscript was about 400 pages more than what you have now. And the other one was the dynamics, how to be able to show that the content was actually the product of a number of circumstances, not least the political evolution in the larger world. And so I started putting it together, and I realized that the reader needed to keep a tab, or needed to be reminded constantly of what happened and when it happened. as a result, in the table of contents, at every single title or subtitle or sub-subtitle, you have in brackets a year. And that's the year when that issue was first taken up in the Commission and later in the Council. And then the challenge arose of how to bring together the substance, the dynamics, because the Commission was actually set up, as you know, as a drafting body. And when it launched itself, it kind of tried to draft the International Bill of Human Rights and was reasonably successful in completing the declaration within less than 2 years. But then the real trouble started when it was expected to draft the rest of the international bill, which are the international covenants and the first optional protocol to the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. Because of the political evolution going on around and the outside world, the membership of the United Nations change profile, and with that change of profile became a change of priorities. The newly decolonized states, when I speak later, I will give details, brought with them a need, a priority, which was to address two issues. One was the issue of self-determination, which is actually the decolonization process, starting momentum in the 50s and 60s. And the other one was the need to address those violations that they had suffered when they were under colonial rule. And so, rather than wait for the international bill to be completed by the, let's say, early 60s, within the Commission, they pressed for ad hoc investigation. The book describes how that happened, and it gives quite a lot of detail. And we don't need to go into that now, but what it does tell us is that what we now call the special procedures overtook the legislative activity of the Commission. The International Bill of Human Rights only entered into force in 1977. At that time, the Commission had started looking at investigations, interpreting its mandate after a very, very complex debate. I counted more than 34 votes on the resolution to get into investigation, because the old school, including René Cassin, who is the eminent French Nobel Prize winner, founder of the Strasbourg Institute, and so on, Santa Cruz, and the others, were insisting on finishing the law first. But the new states said, well, we're never going to finish this law because the Cold War had put a kind of halt on the development. And as the non-aligned movement emerged in the early 60s, you had some dilution, but still the fact remains that what started as a series of ad hoc decisions to look into specific questions materialized into something which we today call the of special procedures. Frankly speaking, it has never been a system. It is not a system. It's a set of ad hoc decisions by the Commission or the Council to investigate or otherwise look into specific situations under specific conditions, even though now, relatively recently, the Council has tried to stylize or to make these procedures a little bit more kind of turn into a system. They're ad hoc. They all rely on the terms of reference that they remain. That all this dynamics confuses students and confuses people, but it is important to understand that even though today we have two main sectors of activity, the conventions and the special procedures, still, in reality, they are constantly moving. It's as I always say, it is a dynamic process, and that is reflective of the anthropological nature of the subject, because it is, after all about human behavior, the behavior of civil society and government, and now of business and so on. Another interesting aspect of these dynamics is the issue which is described in the first chapters, I think chapter 1 even, where the divorce, it's called, the subchapter is called The Great Divorce. The divorce took place in the division of civil and political rights from economic, social, and cultural rights. Now that is the embryo which today looks at us as what Ravi mentioned as the role of business in human rights. Throughout that evolution, the business first was identified as an impediment composed of the policies of multinational corporations as being getting into the way of the implementation of civil and economic and social cultural rights. And later on, into the 90s with Kofi Annan's Global Compact at Davos. And today, of course, business, or philanthropy, if you like, is actually threatening, if not dictating, international, what should be international intergovernmental policy. If you look at WHO today, you will see that it takes for granted the input from what I call, or what people call, philanthrocapitalism. And that all has its source in that division in 1952, 51, 52. So the book tries to trace that. That's why you have a system in the digitized version. You have a system of references that enables you to hop from one chapter to the other on the same topic, so that you don't have to read the rest of the material and not get distracted by it. So the purpose is actually to, anybody can use it. Now, in order to fit all this stuff in, I had to resort to constructing a virtual library. The library, the book has something like nearly 6,000 footnotes. And these footnotes contain something like 8,000 references. Each of those references can be easily retrieved from the digital library of the UN, the official library, in 6 languages in most cases, simply by entering that reference in the digital. And that's for that reason, the note at the beginning of the book entitled Note for the Reader is precisely intended, it's just 1 page, to show how easy it is to access the reports of all rapporteurs by theme, all special procedures, and so it seems to have worked, because frankly speaking, I am using it myself quite a lot as I working on my second book and so on. Now, a number of spin-offs, very interesting spin-offs taking place from these series of discussions like today. Yes, it's a big book, but as my dear colleague reminded me, it's also known as a brick, which can serve several purposes for those who may need self-defense or whatever. What else do we need? Yes. At the end of the book, there are 2 chapters. Chapter 10 is the one dedicated to civil society. That is essential for civil society to see what windows civil society has, in what procedures and so on. And it gives also a description of how these procedures developed. I'll comment that later when I come back to this in the second part. But in any case, what I couldn't help, and please bear with me, as I say throughout the book, I'm trying my hardest for the book to speak for itself, for the Commission to speak for itself, because we read a lot of material about the Commission and the Council. A lot of that stuff is understandably negative. Not so understandably, it should be a bit more objective, but there you are. But the fact remains that when you go through this huge historical evolution, you end up with things you need to share. And that is basically the epilogue. In the epilogue, the book proposes first of all, a council of the whole. The council at the moment has 47 member states. And as you know, the fact that there are only 47, the Commission ended up with 53. The fact is that we have a limited number gives rise to endless, boring, and pointless discussions on who is good and who deserves and who doesn't deserve to sit on the council. Even the pledges that are required under 6251 are today just pro forma. There is therefore a need for the council to be an organ of the whole. It's not John Pace saying that, it is the eminent panel on threats and challenges shortly before the council was set up, which recommended with very good reason that the Commission and any future body should be open to the whole. Too much time and energy is wasted on deciding who deserves or not. As I always say, human rights is not a beauty contest. There is no such thing as better or worse. I do not like, and I don't think we should have tables like some NGOs have saying, this year that country has done better. Why? Because they have tortured less. Big deal. So therefore we need to eliminate that barrier, that distraction, and have a permanent council. Once you have a permanent council, it needs two props. One is the civil society, which, as Ravi pointed out,
council, it needs two props. One is the civil society, which, as Ravi pointed out, council, it needs two props. One is the civil society, which, as Ravi pointed out, council, it needs two props.
You need to mute Ravi, you need to mute your video.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I love hearing myself.
No, he was playing back the YouTube link. That's what happened.
Yeah, that's fine.
Go ahead.
That's fine. No problem at all. But anyway, the fact is that governments left alone cannot, with all due respect, efficiently assess human rights. It is simply not possible for any given government to address effectively human rights issues. It doesn't mean that they are bad. It doesn't mean that they are unwilling. It doesn't mean that they are malicious. It means simply that human rights issues require the input of people. That's how it was conceptualized, and that's how it has developed over the years, over the decades. And we see when there's a problem, it's usually because there is either a lack of attention to the situation of people. If you look at the third preambular paragraph to the Universal Declaration, which actually addresses the likelihood of revolution and violence if the rule of law is not maintained, you will see what I mean. Therefore, civil society has to be a party to the process. Like governments, civil society is not pure, and therefore one should not, if you like, sanctify civil society. Civil society should be addressed as a party, a factor in a totality, an element. It's not the be-all and end-all. But civil society needs a role and influence into it. And therefore, the chamber that the book proposes is based on 5 forums in the 5 regions, or they can be more or less, it doesn't matter. And as Ravi pointed out, that is not new. I actually borrowed that quite rudely from the experience we made in the preparation of the World Conference, which took place in '93. The Bangkok Declaration that Ravi mentioned is worth reading. It is a real work of art, if you like, because it brought in the whole notion, it addressed the issue beautifully in terms of, at that time, there was a kind of cultural relativist movement going on, mainly from the Asian continent. But still, the NGO declaration at Bangkok gave the green light or gave the lead to the governmental version of the Bangkok meeting. With the Bangkok Declaration of the Intergovernmental Meeting borrowed quite a few important elements from the NGO declaration. And so the forum idea, what I call a chamber for civil society, of course it needs to be developed, and I'm hoping that in these days NGOs would amplify this idea, but it's essential because I will mention later, the problem now is governments have always resisted civil society, sometimes with good reason, sometimes with very bad reason. But the fact is that what the Council has done now has never specifically prohibited. Yes, they kept NGOs out of the Universal Periodic Review completely. No NGO, you can only make a written submission, and that written submission will be then summarized into 10 pages by the Secretariat. And if you look at the list of submissions written by NGOs, you'll find 50, 60, 100 submissions to reduce into 10 pages, even with the genius of the Secretariat that we know exists. But so they're out. We need to bring them in. And the way it has been done, it's very clever to keep them out, is to flood the market. As I will say later, at the session last year, at this time, there were, I think, nearly 400 NGOs who participated or listed in the report of the Council. How can you get any benefit from the input of 400 NGOs in a session that is completely saturated with various other matters? So that is a problem that the book tries to address by encouraging reflection on how to streamline or filter the NGO input. The other one, which is equally vital, is the treaty system. I am suggesting, the book suggests, a chamber for norms and standards. A lot of the good work, they do excellent work of the treaty bodies, is wasted because it's limited only to the parties that they, even though the general comments and recommendations generally to the treaty as a whole. But it is clear from the experience of the Council that the Council would be very much benefited if it were to take into account the international human rights legal interpretations and jurisprudence of the treaty bodies. And therefore, the treaty bodies in this chamber, I suggest a chamber made up of the 2 main ones, plus a reference body for the other treaty bodies, to advise the Council on the international human rights legal aspects of the work, to make the work of the Commission, of the Council much easier, and it would give a big and welcome boost to the treaty system. Last is the special procedures. As I said earlier, the special procedures have done invaluable work. But the Council is not very happy with that, I get the feeling, because already, for example, the complaints, allegations handled by special procedures, in most cases, there are 1 or 2 exceptions, are no longer tabled in the main report of the rapporteur to the Council. They are taken as and incorporated into a kind of quasi-statistical document which is put to the UPR, where NGOs can't be. And even if you look at the document before the UPR, you will see a kind of technical acronym infested document, which only the avid interested party can actually try to decipher to see what it's about. And that is not in the nature of special procedures. So unfortunately, the policies followed by the council at this time, regardless of their intentions, is to limit not only input by civil society, but also exposure of states, of governments rather, to the wider audience to which they are accountable. And that's why, and I want to cut short now, but that's why the book, I felt that the book needed to end with this kind of analysis or proposal. It is what the book itself produced. It wasn't anybody's invention. It was the result, it's the logical stage in the evolution that needs to be entered at this phase. I think I'll stop here and come back later on accountability. I'm sorry if I took too long, but anyway, and one final word. Yes, that I think why shouldn't we end with the beginning? If you look at the cover of the book, you will see the ceiling of the Human Rights Council chamber and the boat of refugees crossing, in that case, the Mediterranean. You know that hundreds drown every year when trying to cross the Mediterranean, and God knows how many in other oceans and seas and overland as they transit. The idea is to say that even though in the book I have tried to be pure and objective and clinical, I am not unconscious of the realities that we are facing. Because it's one thing to have the chamber with this beautiful Spanish artistic ceiling, but it's also important to keep in mind that the equally beautiful Mediterranean is actually one of the best cemeteries that we have in the last few years. So on that not so joyful note, I would thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And thank you for your interest in the book. I'm really very moved, I must say. And let's hope that as and when we get the opportunity, we shall be together in India this time, not just on a screen. Thank you. You need to unmute yourselves, I think.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Thank you very much, John, for that excellent exposition. It is for the reader to dig and delve deep into it to understand what a treasure trove it is on human rights history, the making of norms and standards, the role of civil society, the role of particular governments. He doesn't point fingers, but then for anybody reading it and understanding what is the gray between the lines, the message is loud and clear. I have I perhaps will take all the questions together at the very end after the three panelists speak. And we also have a round on the issue of sovereignty and accountability. I have great pleasure in introducing Anand Grover. Arnold is a senior advocate in the Supreme Court. That's saying very little. For the UN link, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. But more importantly, he was the man who, in the Supreme Court and his organization and partners, did the work on HIV/AIDS, on a whole range of LGBT rights, and made sure that they were not in the shadows. Apart from that, of course, on civil and political rights, he's constantly the go-to lawyer for everyone detained under many governments. And while this government has made detentions of young people, cottage industry, we have Sir Galahad Anand Grower to the rescue. So Anand, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ravi. It's a pleasure to be such eminent people, and particularly John. I'm really, really happy that this book has come out. Frankly, it was a lot of it was a revelation to me. I've read bits and pieces of these issues over a period of time. I think it's a very useful. I mean, it's like a text. It's not a popular book to be, which would be available to the lay persons, but I wish it is. But it's also like a textbook and a reference book. I think it's a great service to human rights advocates and makes very important points in terms of the issues that actually face human rights advocates, states, and multilateral organizations. I have a couple of points to make. I mean, I think John was apt in actually pointing out that India was sort of a permanent member of the Commission and now partly the Council in one sense. And that's very important because we actually are now going through a period in India which actually requires an even more watchful eye from the human rights perspective. And we also should dig up our data and history and to find out how India has actually been responding to issues of human rights internationally and how we have actually made inputs and where we have failed, particularly now because like the rest of the world, there's a complete shift on these issues. And I think we are going through a period in India which will see a denudation of human rights, and therefore it'll be very important to see how we can actually shape up ourselves. From that point of view, I think the book is really, really welcome. Secondly, I think it's made a very, very important point of the role of civil society. And I think the civil society has been very participative. They put in a lot of effort, but structurally they are not able to intervene in key areas. And John has pointed out the Universal Periodic Review. I think there the issue is how we push the agenda that I agree with John, how we push civil society participation. And I think civil society participation is the key, as John has actually pointed out. And if we are able to fashion a strategy on the basis of what has happened in history, which is documented by John, it'll be a very, very valuable thing. I can just tell you, there are some issues I would like to highlight here. Unfortunately, what is happening is, and I think that's also a structural problem and we have to address it. What is happening is that the developed countries, because of the resources available, they have a large number of organizations of civil society who are more participative in the council, in the commission. So how do we change that is a very big issue. I know that Indians always keep on complaining. By the way, Indians are very argumentative, even in the commission stroke council, and sometimes we are actually seen to be too abrasive, which I think is a good thing in the sense we should be abrasive. But there are complaints by our neighbors that their NGOs are not getting a voice in. But overall, I think there has to be encouragement of development of developed countries' participation and how they relate to the developing countries' NGO participation. There has to be a structural intervention where NGOs from the developing world can actually participate. There's a problem here, and that's what I also saw in the special procedures when I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, which is that a lot of the funding comes from private organizations. So developed country NGOs have a large advantage. I mean, here in India, for example, philanthropic organizations have not been encouraging human rights organizations at all. There are hardly any human rights organizations which are funded by local philanthropists. In the last 2 years, philanthropists have come, but they're basically focusing on developmental activity. Only few of them are contributing and donating to NGOs working on human rights issues. And that's the scene all over the developing world. So even if we talk, and then John rightly says civil society participation is vital, how do we make sure that the NGOs working on human rights from the developing world ought to be there? And that's also because the developing world's problems are more acute in terms of human rights. You can see this across the world. The other thing I wanted to ask John, and this is more of a question, though he actually highlighted this, the two organs, as it were, of the Commission Stroke Council now, the governments and civil society, there's a third one which has come in terms of businesses. And he also pointed out that what he calls philanthropic capitalism is playing a very, very important part. In fact, let me tell you in confidence, I don't know whether this is Clapham rules applying or not, but in any event, I must tell you that in fact, when I was a special rapporteur, one of the recommendations to me to inquire in...
Anand, just to interrupt, this is public, completely public. It's being broadcast on...
Doesn't matter.
And it's recorded, so no Chatham House rules. It's completely public and open. Yeah.
Chatham rules
just for your information.
Yeah. No, anyway, I want to make a point on this, that when I was the special rapporteur, there was a recommendation to me to investigate / inquire into how funding by philanthropic organizations is in fact impacting on the research agenda of the WHO, for example, as also how it impacts on the type of human rights issues that are taken up. Okay, and in fact, philanthropic contribution in the UN system has become a very dominant one now. So how they fashion also impacts on how business is seen. And I think that's one of the largest failings of the UN system. And John Ruggie principle that is actually alluded to in the book also to me shows the complete weakness of how the UN system and the Council and the Commission have not been able to deal with business houses or the business enterprises. The principles are voluntary, for example. I don't want to get into the merits of it because we're talking about the book. But the issue that arises is when business is such an important part in development, which impacts human rights, how is it that after so many years, we have not been able to deal with it properly? And that shows the weakness, and it's partly brought out and thankfully alluded to by John. The final point I want to make, not the final, the penultimate point, is about the special procedures. And I think John is absolutely on ball, as it were, pointing out the special procedures are not really systems, they're ad hoc mechanisms. But I'm thankful they're ad hoc to some extent, because were it not for that, there'll be so much of bureaucracies in it that we won't be able to work. I think it was fortuitous that it was not a system with the bureaucratic kind of entrappings it normally would have. I'll just give you two examples. My experience and my predecessors on the rapporteurs on health, and even now the new successor has alluded to it, was the fact that we are completely independent. We were completely independent, we still are independent, and it is entirely up to us what we do, which is actually allows a lot of flexibility. So that's one very big advantage. But what happens to the reports? Where is the actual action on the reports? And in the complaints mechanism, which is an important part, is just rendered into a void, which John has pointed out, into the UPR, a statistical figure. Nothing really happens to it. But when the reports are presented, the questions are asked, it's a valuable exercise. The whole community knows about what is happening in a particular country, and people are, all states and even others are allowed to ask questions. I think that's a very valuable experience. But more on the actual visits, there are three parts to the procedures. One is the complaints mechanism. which is actually very important, but not really brought into the public light as much as it should be. The second is the actual visits, which are dependent on the invitations of the states. And the third is the reports, which are thematic reports. The visits to the countries, I think, is an amazing procedure. And I think it would not be easy for John to bring that out, because the procedure, the special procedure reports would be too bulky for this book to capture. Maybe in another edition of it, somehow it should be brought in. And I'll give you an example of this, which I found very, very important. And I will compare it to the case I've just done, which I think Ravi was alluding to. There's the very famous Bhima Koregaon case going on, and I was representing one of the poets, Dr. Vara Rao, who has been in jail for the last 2 years without trial. And the trial is not likely to start for 5 years. Now, even getting a visit during COVID for lawyers was impossible. And now it's gone back to the original thing, but the visits are only for 15 minutes across a sort of a fence, that you see in American movies sometimes. But in contrast to that, when I had gone to Syria, and I can give you an anecdote to make things lighter, this because these are serious issues where this kind of comments are important. I had asked to visit a particular jail, and the protocol is that once the request to the invitation is accepted, then basically the rapporteur has a field day. She can actually ask anything and they have to comply with it. So I had asked to visit a particular jail, but Syrians being very diplomatic at that time, or their branch of human rights, they said, and the person who was in charge was very sophisticated, French, English, Dutch speaking, of course Arabic. And on the second day he asked me, have all the meetings been set up? I said, all except the particular jail. So he reprimanded his junior. 5 days later, the same question is asked, and same question, same answer. So they knew my flight timings. So they said, well, we can arrange a meeting tomorrow morning, because my flight was at about 12. But so I knew this was coming, so I made arrangements to having a later flight also. So they said, okay, you can go at 6 o'clock in the morning. I said, of course. They didn't expect me to go at 6 o'clock because they knew I had to be at the airport according to the timings I had given them. But I was going on a later flight, so I took advantage of that. But the thing I'm going to tell you is that I was allowed to visit the jail in Syria before the hostilities broke out, and I could see everything. I could report on it, which you can't do that even in your own domestic country. That is the power of a special procedures. That's what I'm talking about. And just another anecdote. There was, of course, the issues of the communities, ethnic strife and ethnic communities, and that was a very sensitive topic. So when the protocol is that you have to actually give the gist of your speech or the press conference to the government so that they can actually try to correct factual errors. So we give that, and that is a sensitive topic, not very much to the liking of the officer in charge. And he said, why can't you drop that? So, I said, well, it would not be proper because my reputation is at stake and so is yours. So he gave up that point. I'm just telling you the way things work. If you're intelligent, you can really do a lot of good work as a special procedure. So I think I want to stop there. But last point is about the numbers game that John talked about. The numbers which are actually part of the Commission Stroke Council. It is perfectly in order, I think, as John has suggested, that it should be the whole community of nations. And that should be plugged in. Finally, I want to only end up with one other point. The relationship between and that is not the remit of the book, but maybe in a future edition, John could take it up or somebody else would do it. The relationship with the General Assembly and the Council. how do they actually feature? Because that's a very major topic, which is bugging a lot of people. The rapporteurs and the procedures, like the rapporteur on health, actually report if it's a country mission to the council now, and if it's thematic report, it can be to either. So, the actual relationship between the two in terms of legal and in terms of practice would be a useful thing to go into on some other occasion. So I'll stop there because I think I just want to finally say that it's a really, really good effort. I have not read the whole book. I've read snippets of it. So I can't really comment, but I can see from the book that it's a very useful book for not only practitioners of human rights, but even for lay people. And I like the style of chronology, by the way. It's not normal, but I like it because as a lawyer, I like to see things chronological. So I am very happy about that part. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm now going to request the third and final panelist.
Can't hear you. Can't hear Ravi.
Me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now, yeah.
Yeah. The third panelist is Dr. Mohan Gopal, and I'm glad that he also accepted the invitation when I requested him to be part of this panel. Dr. Gopal did a brilliant job as an educationist on legal and academic issues at the National Law School University in Bangalore, which for many years was the only law school university in India. Now there's, of course, a plethora of them across the country, but it still, in many ways, holds the flag aloft in terms of academic excellence. But more importantly was his latter appointment as the director of the National Judicial Academy. Now, this is extremely important because a lot of the judiciary, and this was not only at the superior judiciary level, but also at the lower judiciary, were very conservative in their attitudes on human rights. And apart from the lectures that he and other invited judges gave, he had this innovative way of bringing many of us from the activist mold, lawyers and non-lawyers, to interact with the judiciary, both the superior judiciary and the lower judiciary, on a range of human rights issues, including international human rights law. And I sometimes wonder how he got the permission, or he just went ahead and did it, to get some of us into that place, because we must have been seen as the Scarlet Pimpernels entering forbidden territory, waiting for our head to be chopped at the guillotine. But, or how did he get the fact that he had got these judges to discuss these issues in our presence? And this was, it was because for many judges, they still think they are on the bench even at the seminar, even in an ordinary academic exchange or even in a friendly exchange. They still think that they haven't taken off their gowns at all. And so this was a very innovative way of getting us to intervene. Suffice to say that it stopped very soon after he left, and that is the loss of the Indian judiciary and the Indian legal system. But it was very useful because many of us who often were standing in courts with lawyers, without lawyers, understood that judges didn't have a clue to what the ground situation was. In fact, Justice Venkatachalaya, a former Chief Justice, told me the day he was demitting office from the National Human Rights Commission, I went in for a farewell call, and I thought it would be a 10 or 15-minute call, but he sat me down, and there was Virendra Dayal, who John would of course know, and of course Mohan knows, from the UN, who had also retired and was now in the NHRC. He said, I wish I had been chairman of the NHRC, the National Human Rights Commission, before going to the bench, because I didn't have a clue to what human rights was and what the problems was in the bench. Now I get to see everything, but I can't do anything. I have no powers. I'm just a recommendatory body. When I had the powers, I was clueless as to what the actual situation was. And this is what he tried to correct in the National Judicial Academy. And without further ado, I mean, he's written a lot copiously. I thought he should be a wonderful panelist. And let me request him to now say what he has to do. Thank you.
Hi, Ravi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I am learning.
Oh, you can do it in the car. No problem.
Can you hear me, Ravi?
We can hear you, Mohan.
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you, Ravi, for those that very kind introduction. And I just want to say that certainly at that time, Justice Venkatachalaya was the person who was the head of the search committee, who I did not even apply to go to the National Judicial Academy. He called me and he ordered me to go there. And because he wanted the academy to be a bridge for conversation between the judiciary and civil society and academia. And so I was simply implementing his vision, and I think it was a very interesting period. And I have to be very fair and say that the vast majority of judges strongly supported it. In fact, I cannot remember even a single judge opposing or questioning this, this open dialogue that we were having with civil society, the bar, academia, and the judiciary in the Judicial Academy. It was extremely successful. There were certain elements of the establishment that were not happy about it outside the judiciary, but they also could not object or stop that. So I think there is a lot of openness in the minds of a lot of judges to talk about issues. One rule that we instituted very firmly, Ravi was a frequent visitor, so he knows this, is we never discussed any case at the academy, either recent past or present cases, because we wanted to focus on the principles of law, which is what now I will, which is a point in which I can segue into the book by John Pache. First of all, thank you, Ravi, for giving me the opportunity to be here. And thank you, John Pache, for a masterpiece, which I think will live on for a very, very long time, because it is one of those great historical documents, which documents in detail, as is necessary, the story of the development of human rights after the Second World War. And it's a treasure of reference books and documents. And as Anand said, it's not likely to be selling like hotcakes in an airport bookshop, but certainly for those who work in this field, it will be a necessary tool. I wish that you may consider publishing it. I don't know if it's possible at this stage, in either online or in a low-cost edition that is accessible to law students and young lawyers in countries such as India, who have a huge appetite for information, and there's no predicting how they will use such information, but who will not be able to afford the book published by OUP. So if there's some way in which it can be made accessible to those who really need it most, I think it would be wonderful. I think in summary, I sort of did a kind of quick mental count, and it's a story of how the discussions in the Nuclear Commission leading to the Human Rights Commission expanded into a massive, very great enterprise, as the president told the Nuclear Commission at the outset, covering some 100 areas of struggle, very, very important to humanity all across the world, and also came to develop at least a dozen very important initiatives, including these ad hoc procedures that were discussed by Anand, and many more very formal intervention mechanisms. So I cannot think of any major concern of human rights that does not seem to have been addressed in one form or the other by the work of the Commission over these over its existence for between 1946 and 2006. So I think it's an extraordinary 1947 and 2006. So, and I think to be able to understand the scope and breadth of the expansion of human rights ideas in this period between 47 and 2006, between two covers, I think is an extremely valuable contribution, not only to research, but also to judging and to advocacy in the future. So thank you, John, for what must have been an extraordinarily hard task of bringing all this together and presenting it in an extremely systematic and easy to read and easy to find method. But when we look back now, so first I want to acknowledge. The second is I want to sort of link now to this broader theme of that we have set for us of sovereignty and accountability. And as we go, great honesty is effort.
Mohan, we are losing you. We've lost you. No, you're cracking up. No.
Is it better now? Now? Is it better?
Yes. Yes. Yes, yes. You're okay now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. The sentence of the book that caught me really thinking, actually not much has changed for the victims of human rights. And in a sense, that is the ultimate accountability that we have. We have to reflect why. And Again, what's happening? Can you hear me? No.
We can hear you when you speak.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Hello.
Yeah. You can hear me now? Yeah.
Hello.
Sorry about that. I think my internet connection was giving problems. Can you hear me now? Ravi?
Yes, yes, very much. Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry about I had some break in.
Ravi, if Mohan is having difficulties with his connection, why don't we go ahead with Q&A
John.
and he can join rather than, I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a much better use of time. Thank you.
You're right, Sanjay. You're absolutely right. Maybe Mohan, I will go on to John, who also wanted to make some comments and state something on the same subject of sovereignty and accountability. And then you can come back and do a second bite at the cherry. John, if I can request you now to come in, and Mohan can follow you once again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I hope the others can too.
Yes. Well, I'll get straight into it. I need to focus on state accountability. As we all know, international law regulates interstate relations, be they bilateral or multilateral. The introduction of human rights into the UN Charter in 1945, which incidentally was an amendment pushed by civil society to the draft charter, added a third dimension to this interstate relationship, and that is, it added the individual, who became the third party in the relations created as a result of international human rights law. The UN Charter contains 8 articles setting out the obligations of states in relation to human rights. And these 8 articles bind all member states. The International Bill of Human Rights was drafted under these provisions. The Universal Declaration was the first component of the International Bill, and since its adoption in 1948, as you know, the Declaration has acquired the force of law, at least as according to the International Court of Justice. Then came the International Covenants. on civil, economic and social rights, and cultural rights, and civil and political rights. And those entered into force in 1977. Under a number of these conventions, these core conventions, states undertook to report to treaty monitoring bodies on the measures taken to comply with these obligations. And the optional protocol to the ICCPR obliges states to respond to allegations by individuals of the state's failure to being protected. Other human rights treaties which came into force over the years remain equally binding. It may be said that the principle of accountability of states has been amply affirmed throughout the history of the Commission on Human Rights, and since 2006, the Human Rights Council. The first case which tested the accountability of member states took place in 1946. That year, India raised the matter of, and I quote, the treatment of people of Indian origin in the Union of South Africa. It did so before the General Assembly, where it was first treated as a bilateral dispute. The Assembly recommended at that time, unsuccessfully, a round-table conference to resolve the problem. That did not work, and segregation in South Africa became government policy and enshrined in law. And in 1962, the Assembly established a special committee against apartheid, and apartheid legislation lasted, as we all know, until 1991, when it was repealed. Interestingly, in 1967, the Special Committee Against Apartheid triggered the first of the special procedures by the Commission. And we shall come back to this in a minute. Permit me to trace how accountability inserted itself in the work of the Commission on Human Rights. The embryo was the Yearbook on Human Rights, which was launched in 1946. The yearbook was a publication that reflected the first efforts at sharing or pooling information by states on human rights on the situation at the domestic level. Publication was discontinued in 1988, by which time other procedures of accountability had been developed. The yearbooks, by the way, are available on the UN Digital Library. They are a valuable and interesting source for research, and I strongly recommend them. Next came the establishment of a system of periodic reports, which was a primitive version of today's Universal Periodic Review. The proposal to set up periodic reporting was introduced in 1950, and the proposal went through several amendments. Eventually, it was set up 6 years later, and as it says in the book, the evolution that took place between 1950 and 56 was particularly significant, coming at a time when the future of the covenants was still in doubt. It sent a message that states were no longer watertight compartments as far as human rights were concerned, and that there was, whichever way it was interpreted, a form of accountability to the international community on human rights matters. It injected the notion of sharing information for mutual benefit. Under this procedure, all this took place during the difficult years of the Cold War, just before the emergence of the non-aligned movement. Under this procedure, governments would submit annual reports to the Secretary General on development and progress achieved in the field of human rights and measures taken to safeguard human liberty. The evolution from the sharing of information through the yearbook to the provision of annual reports enabled the development of a system of periodic reporting. This system was to last for 25 years, and by the time it was discontinued in 1981, the international covenants had entered into force, and the reporting procedure under the covenants had come into effect. The next phase in the process of strengthening accountability of states came in 1967. That year, the Commission took up the invitation of the Special Committee Against Apartheid to investigate allegations of torture in South Africa. This was the first case of an investigation by a Commission on Human Rights delegation. Although the Commission on Human Rights had not yet taken up situations in specific countries and even less to investigate, it was a matter of time until it would find itself having to do so. Earlier attempts had not taken off. For instance, in 1957, Ceylon had proposed that the Commission take up violations of human rights in Algeria. That, at that time, was swiftly opposed by France and neutralized through a procedural move by the USSR. The same year, in 57, China raised the plight of the Chinese community in Vietnam. In 1963, the Assembly sent a fact-finding mission to Vietnam to examine the relations between the government of the Republic of Vietnam and the Vietnamese Buddhist community. That mission ended in 13 December 63, when the Assembly decided not to continue consideration of this item. Coup d'etat on 1 November 63 had rendered the original purpose of the mission redundant. This experience broke new ground in a number of ways. It cleared the way for what was to follow at the Commission on Human Rights. The fact that it was a human rights mission and that it was supported by the Department of Human Rights made it so. In 1966, the International Labour Office proposed the inclusion of the question of violations of human rights in Burundi on the agenda of the Commission. The proposal was not pressed after Burundi undertook to send a mission to the ILO to establish facts and hold discussions. Gradually, the focus, which had largely concentrated on drafting the international human rights legal framework, moved on to addressing human rights problems in Southern Africa, notably in the territories under Portuguese administration, in Southwest Africa and Southern Rhodesia. And here, it should be recalled that until 1955, there were only 4 member states of the UN from Africa. Until 1955. And these were Ethiopia, Egypt, Liberia, and South Africa. That's all. This then changed dramatically in the late 50s and 60s, with 36 African states becoming members of the UN by 1968. The Commission was enlarged to 32 members in 66, and this was bound to bring new perspective on human rights work at the United Nations. In the mid-60s, this new thinking arrived at the Commission, and it had its roots in 2 General Assembly committees. The first in 1966 was the Special Committee on Decolonization. In June 65, that committee drew the attention of the Commission to evidence submitted by petitioners concerning violations of human rights committed in territories under Portuguese administration and also in Southwest Africa and Southern Rhodesia. This was followed by the request from the Special Committee Against Apartheid, which I just mentioned, about asking the Commission to investigate allegations of torture. And therefore, in 1966, a debate of critical importance took place on the competence of the Commission of Human Rights. The main point was whether the Commission was being asked to look into violations of human rights in all countries, or whether the request was limited simply to racism and racial discrimination in certain countries. In short, it was the decision that opened the way to investigation. The first of these was the so-called ad hoc working group of experts on South Africa, and there is a reason for that title, and followed by the situation in the occupied Palestine in 1969, and the situation in Chile after the military takeover in 73. The Commission formally expanded its mandate to include violations of human rights in all countries, and soon thereafter in, quote-unquote, all parts of the world. Hence accountability. As a consequence, at its 1968 session, an unprecedented number of national situations were raised in the Commission. This included the situation in Greece, the occupation by Israel of Palestine after the '67 war, the United States and the war in Vietnam, violations of freedom of expression in the USSR and the Ukrainian SSR, and the situation in Haiti, all in one session in '68. And this was the origin of what we call today the special procedures. Since then, more than 100 countries have been the subject of various forms of inquiry or investigation in public or on confidential procedure. These are all contained in Chapter 6A. And soon, these procedures expanded into thematic mandates, which involves investigation of allegations in several countries, as Special Rapporteur Grover just described. There are now currently over 40 such procedures covering a wide range of human rights, and these can be found listed and historically described in Chapter 6B. The establishment of the Council in 2006 brought with it the Universal Periodic Review, by which the situation of human rights in every member state of the UN is subject of a periodic review. So that completed the whole idea of accountability. The Council has, in addition, established several fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry on situations in a number of countries. Fact-finding missions have also been dispatched by the High Commissioner in recent years. Over 30 such missions have been established. I have given a summary of the milestones showing how accountability of states emerge. States have been and remain accountable to the international community. Although they have primary responsibility domestically, no state is beyond international scrutiny. That said, from time to time, governments have invoked various reasons to limit or avoid accountability. In the early 90s, for instance, cultural relativism was raised, according to which the universality of human rights was questioned. It was based on the assumption that each country or region was well qualified to protect human rights within the parameters of their respective cultures and traditions. This was effectively addressed by the formulation adopted at the 1993 Bangkok Declaration at the regional preparatory meeting for the World Conference. The Bangkok meeting was a historic event. It was the first time ever that governments from the Asian region had met on a human rights agenda. It should also be remembered for the historic meeting of NGOs and the contribution of that forum to the governmental processes. One cannot address accountability for human rights without mentioning the vital role of civil society. Throughout the history of human rights in the post-war era, it was human rights NGOs who ensured that accountability did work, and little would have been possible without their dedication and sacrifice. NGOs have been subject to reprisals and other forms of harassment and intimidation. Unfortunately, this persists in spite of the declaration of 9 December 1988, which is meant to protect human rights defenders. 7 years ago, the Council launched an initiative requesting the creation of what it called civil society space in their respective countries. But the Council appears to be following a policy to minimize its accountability. A stockade mentality seems to be prevailing, where, for example, governments have kept civil society virtually out of the UPR, where allegations against governments contained in the report of special procedures are sidetracked into the UPR. The admission of large numbers of civil society organizations should be seen as a laudable opening to all or any group, but it also creates a logjam which negatively affects the contribution of civil society in the work of the Council. For instance, over 290 were tried to participate at last year's February session of the Council. These are not encouraging factors, but we hope that the Council will reverse this trend. This time is appropriate. The Council is to conduct a review of its work during the period 2021-2026 and to propose methods and procedures to improve its efficiency. So there you are. It's now in your hands, you gentlemen and ladies, to carry the ball forward to bring about this very badly needed improvement in the methods and procedures of the Council. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Dr. Gopal, you were hijacked by me.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I've lost track. Anyway, I'll try to.
I think Ravi could.
Ravi, you're muted. Ravi, you're muted. You're muted.
Okay, I can come in giving you some time to gather your thoughts once again. Is that okay?
Sorry?
I can come in now to allow you a few minutes to gather your thoughts once again.
No, my thoughts are gathered, but I'm not sure whether will flow. That's my only concern, because the discussion will be disjointed. Is my concern, and it's my thoughts are very much gathered. So I'm happy to go by whatever you wish.
Go right ahead then, please.
Okay. So I'll just make a couple of in the remaining, points. I'll just make a couple of the main points. The main point I wanted to make was, based on my long experience being in a multilateral organization as and working on these issues, I feel that that the approach focuses on, like the epilogue in this book, on how, and it's very important, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's extremely important, on how to carry forward the institutional framework, how to evolve the institutional framework within which these institutions have evolved in the past, where they are now, and where they will go in the future. But they're all, I can see that they're all, because I was very involved in these reorganization committees of the world, that they're all constrained by a number of factors. Their ability to evolve is actually very limited, and they're struggling with it right now. All these UN organizations, including the World Bank and the IMF, are struggling with it. So that's how then we expect this framework to be the framework within which struggles take place in developing countries, and we are setting the agenda for those struggles, proactively. But what I found coming back to India, people like Ravi Nair, Anand Grover, Indira Jaisingh, various others, a very large number of people, they are engaged in their own struggle about taking India 1,300 million people forward based on India's own history, its past, its present, its future, its current constraints, institutional frameworks. We are engaged in our own struggle. So, but here there is no attempt to control the global, that we are setting an agenda for the world. It's our struggle. So my feeling is that when we look forward, the three challenges identified by Mr. Pache, four challenges identified by Mr. Pache I've just noted them down here. One second. They were four challenges going forward. Four challenges. One was, I think, universality, achieving universality. And the second was achieving, improving the intervention with civil society. And the third was, if I remember right, the strategic engagement with the Security Council, and therefore the evolution into of the Human Rights Council into a charter organ of the United Nations, directly created by the General Assembly, with the civil society chamber and a a chamber on human rights, a human rights chamber. And but I would say that actually that is important in terms of the institutional evolution. But the three challenges I see as most important in these last 15 years of watching and observing the struggle going on here and in our country on the same issues is, first of all, how do we make the tools that come from the international global system to us more effective? So I've seen, for example, Lawyers Collective use these tools very effectively to create one of my favorite pieces of legislation created by Indira Jaising, which is the Protection of Women Against Domestic Violence Act. And various, so at the level of norms being set in the UN Human Rights Framework, they're very useful tools and inputs into our own battles to take forward our own struggles in the ways that we want to take them forward, keeping our constitution as our centerpiece, our constitutional framework. We have an extraordinary constitution here as the centerpiece. So how to make sure that the international system can stop being a place where the global agenda is being set, which was the Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR sort of challenge at that point of time, and move towards 70 some years later, move towards a framework where there is a production of useful ideas, especially in the area of setting norms. The UN framework, the human rights framework, may not have been very effective in terms of protection, enforcement, which is one of the reasons why Mr. Pache must have said that it has nothing much has changed for the victims of human rights. But certainly it has been very useful and very productive in the sense of norm setting and generating new norms, fleshing out new norms. So Vishaka guidelines, we have selectively used these norms to supplement and complement and flesh out our own constitution and our own laws and our own public understanding, public discourse, public minds. So if the input to us can be sort of norm setting as the area where the human rights framework has actually been very effective, that continues to be a useful input to us. But when we are all tried to be put into a master framework to tackle human rights issues, it's an impossible task. It can never be done. I mean, the world has gone beyond that. This is another way of Rome trying to run the world. You can't do it. In fact, New Delhi cannot run India. Trivandrum cannot run Kerala. It's just, we have to be more practical in terms of what we can do. So what we can do is to provide a more effective rethink rather than go in this way. Let's say that Mr. Pache's agenda is fully accepted and the Human Rights Council becomes an organ of the United Nations, directly reporting to the General Assembly with all members as members. Is that going to change the conclusion that it will much change for the victims of human rights by that? I think there's a huge distance between that and the human rights victims on the ground. We have to rethink, we have to have some kind of discontinuous evolution of this framework. The world has changed. We can't simply go from Human Rights Commission to Human Rights Council to a new type of Human Rights Council. We need recognizing that this has not been effective, we need a completely new approach. And the question for that approach is, how can we be useful, most useful to the struggles going on in countries? Recognizing also that all human rights norms came from the struggles of common people and poor people against hegemony, not only in developing countries, but also in Europe, but also in developing countries and in all these countries. So it is the struggles are the womb from which these norms and these changes of consciousness occurred, like the civil rights struggle in the United States has been a very important factor in pushing a more just society. So I think that's the first challenge that I see. How can the very important and very useful thinking that is going on at the universal, at the global level, be actually more effective as an input into our own struggle. Now, that is because sovereignty is also important. Sovereignty is also important because either we abolish sovereignty for everyone, but we can't have selective weakening of sovereignty because then the poor people become vulnerable. So we have to transition towards a framework where there is a parity of reduction and change of sovereignty. Today, sovereignty is asserted very strongly by G7 countries and China. And frankly, the sovereignty of everyone else simply means our ability to collectively look after ourselves has become weakened from 50, 60, 70 years ago. We all feel more vulnerable now than we ever did. So if you look at sovereignty as hegemony, sure, it's not bad. It's not good. We don't want it. But if you look at sovereignty as solidarity, giving, as a tool that complements it's the sovereignty of the people. It's mentioned in our preamble to our constitution. The sovereignty of India is a preambular commitment, but it is based on democracy. It's the sovereignty of the people of India. So sovereignty vis-a-vis people who are not bound by our constitution. But I would argue that the state should not assert sovereignty vis-a-vis its own citizens. There must be maximum accountability to its own citizens. So once democracy comes in, sovereignty becomes simply a tool of protecting democracy and protecting the people of a country from jurisdictions or forces that do not accept the constitution. But sovereignty cannot be treated, in my view, any longer. Once we have a democratic constitution and we do not accept that the king is above the law, we've rejected that. Our courts have rejected that principle, that everyone is accountable. The government is accountable. The state is accountable. We have, over the last 70 years, developed jurisprudence that clearly holds a state accountable at various levels. So we have to push forward, push out the idea of sovereignty in terms of the relationship between the state and its own citizens and the people inside the country, but keep sovereignty strong in terms of protecting our democracy and protecting the rights of people. And in that respect, I think, so the second point I would make is that we must look at sovereignty and accountability in a way that, in a more nuanced way, because we cannot be put into a situation where we become more vulnerable to, on one hand, strengthening sovereignty, and the other hand, declining ability to self-govern. Sovereignty for us is a tool of must be a tool of self-governance, not a tool of being ruled by a dictator. So we need a more nuanced understanding, philosophically and theoretically, more nuanced understanding of sovereignty and accountability, in my view. The third and last point I'd say is that the norms and mechanisms that are now available with the human rights framework have two major deficiencies. One is that they are selective in their operation. They're selective in their operation. Because they're constrained by the G7 politics, they're only applied when it comes to certain countries. They're not applied when it comes to certain other countries, depending on the geopolitical interests of these countries. So they are not predictable, they're not reliable, and they're selective. And related to that is a second problem, that they're closely aligned with the foreign policy and political external policies of the government. So if the government simply aligns with military interests or corporate interests, then they can go to any extent to violate domestic human rights of their people, and you will get no reaction or very little reaction from the global space. So that takes away the credibility of these mechanisms, that they are applied to the weakest. You'll apply them to Afghanistan, you'll apply them to Iraq, you'll apply them to, but you won't apply them to India, with a pro-business India. You won't apply them to China. You won't apply them to Europe. You won't apply them to Trump's United States, right? And so this is an old criticism, but I think a very important one, because we need predictable mechanisms that can help us. So I would put forward a suggestion I've made in other forums, which is, I think we need a trigger. I'm borrowing from my multilateral financial institution background. We need a trigger. So if the laws of a country are amended clearly to take away democracy, human rights, freedom of the press, independence of the press, not gray area, but black and white, like has happened in Burma now, then it must automatically trigger sanctions from other countries. And those sanctions should not come from a multilateral mechanism, they should come bilaterally. So there should be a norm that if there are disappearances, you're violating, you're arresting, you're engaging in what we call selective prosecution of human rights activists, picked and chosen on flimsy grounds simply to disable them and paralyze them. If these kinds of incidents are being reported, then there should be an international norm that under domestic law of G7 countries and other countries, there should be a trigger that we cannot do business with this country anymore. And it should not be a matter of discretion. It should be insulated from politics. It should be as mechanical as possible. And keep it at a high threshold. But if a certain threshold is passed, there should be a trigger that human rights violation above a certain threshold will immediately make it illegal in international law for any country to deal with that country, like we are now seeing happen when it comes to, for example, sanctions against Iran and sanctions against the countries that the United States has a military conflict with. So fine, but why don't we extend that to say that we must have much more objective triggers, so that the whole idea is produce norms which are useful to us, universal in nature, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, many of the detailed declarations of human rights are very, very useful to us. Address the issues of selectivity and political influence by introducing a much more objective trigger mechanism that will balance the issue of, so it doesn't become interference in sovereignty, because every country will, as a matter of domestic law, say, we will not deal with another country. So let's say India now will, under Indian law, must have a trigger saying we cannot deal with Burma anymore because they've overthrown their elected government. That must be a trigger, and that must then, once that is established as a jus cogens, then it must be brought in as a part of the judiciary must interpret it and make it part of domestic constitutional law. It will take time, but we must introduce the concept of a trigger that is insulated from politics, which is already available in the financial sector, in the military sector, but not in the human rights sector. So why not import that idea into the human rights sector is something. So I think my basic message is we can't have this repeat of the last 70 years. These institutions have worked. We need new approaches, because the situation is very dire. Many countries are now facing a severe attack on liberty and democracy. And we must have more effective mechanisms which will protect our sovereignty. I am not for compromising on our sovereignty, because we fought hard against colonialism to gain that sovereignty. No one gave it to us on a platter. Sovereignty is important, and you must be accountable to uphold the sovereignty of the people, not the sovereignty in a narrow way of the government. The trouble is that the international law mechanisms are still they're trying to come out of it. The GEF is a good example. There are green shoots of new thinking, but to take it out of the pure framework of intergovernmental relations and put it into a space where these norms come through a body of well accepted principles that are seen as valued by everyone all across the world, and they work through, where possible, through our constitutions. Actually, it is the Constitution of India that gives life to the UDHR in India. It is a part 3 of the Constitution and a preamble and the jurisprudence around Part 3 of the Constitution that gives life to human rights law in India. You remove the Constitution and the human rights law will be ineffective in India. And therefore, we need to have much more of an integration of the implementation mechanisms between the national mechanisms and the international mechanisms, rather than think in terms of national nation state versus sovereign nation states versus no national sovereignty, or transnationalism, which is coming from the global north. We need to work on developing much more detailed design, constitutional detailed design. I call this a fine print of democracy. Democracy can exist only when there is a lot of fine print and detail. And that detail needs to be developed. India, over the last many years, now they're trying to undo it, has developed a lot of fine print of democracy. The Protection against of Women Against Domestic Violence Act brings a lot of fine print of democratic and equality to the bedrooms of couples, saying that you can't treat your wife any way you please, right? So we need to work on building that fine print of democracy together, learning from the world, learning from the world's experience, but we have to construct it. We have to construct it. And otherwise it's not going to be sustainable. So I think we a fantastic job in recording the past, but I think the way forward requires, in my view, a vision that will respond to, in a very practical way, the enormous crisis that certainly India is facing, but not in terms of imposition of international power into India, because no one trusts that international power. They are just pushing their own national interests. But in terms of being able to learn from the best democratic practices at the global level in other countries, and strengthen our own institutions and use foreign precedents in our courts, use international law in our courts, as many of the people here, Ravi Nair and others, have done very well over the last many years. I mean, that's where I think we need to strengthen and move forward. Let me stop here, Ravi. You're muted. Ravi is muted.
Yeah, can I take the prerogative of the moderator and say a few things, which is a bee in my bonnet, which is accountability. India was very good, as John mentioned, in the 1945 conference, raising the issue of the treatment of Indians in South Africa under apartheid. And we, as John pointed out, we in a way won the argument in the way the Committee on Apartheid and the Committee on Decolonization was set up. And thanks in that conference to the support of the United States, which wanted to break up the colonial empires at that point of time. France, Spain, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, which were very vociferous in opposing India's attempt to bring what they called a bilateral issue between them and South Africa into an international forum. Having said that, I think no country has been Simon Pure on the issue of international accountability. To a lesser or greater extent, all of them have been caught with their hands to the till, in the till. And but India is a special case. And this is where I fall foul of the pundits in the International Legal Division of the Ministry of External Affairs and all the other spook agencies which decide to work externally and internally to make sure there is no accountability. Our last periodic report to the UN Human Rights Committee, which is the most powerful treaty body at the moment, was given in 2001. It's the year of the Lord 2021. Rip Van Winkle, call it that, or call it the Indian version, the eternally sleeping Kumbhakarna. Choose your pick. We have just forgotten what a 4-year cycle means and just are waiting for 20 years to be exact, to file our overdue periodic report. Second, in spite of Article 51 of the Constitution about us professing fealty to international law, look at our declaration on the right to compensation in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So you can imprison a person for 20 years, find him guilty or not guilty, most probably guilty, not guilty, or even without, or in preventive detention without any charge, and then release him without a cent or a rupee or a paisa in compensation. So we made a declaration. The word declaration is an Indian euphemism for reservation. They want to look like good guys. So compensation is not available. Then the issue of prosecution of perpetrators. It is like climbing a glass mountain. We have section 193 of the Criminal Procedure Code, further strengthened after the troubles in the Punjab in the 80s and early 90s, and now impossible to penetrate. Strengthened by sections 5 and 6 of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and different sections of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. I won't go into a long litany. This is a hobby horse of mine, prosecution of perpetrators. But the latest is the good judgment of Justice Madan Lokur in the MFAM case, in the Manipur disappearances case, where he's found, after the investigation of some honest Central Bureau of Investigation officers, over 1,200 cases of disappearances. And the units and personnel of the Assam Rifles and the Manipur police have been identified. After a lot of local political noise being made in Manipur, the Manipur police, some of them, about 167 of them, are being prosecuted locally. But the Assam Rifles, which is under the Union Home Ministry, Niyat, Nahi, no. Which language do you want me to use? No prosecutions. 5 years after the judgment, after not an NGO green behind the ears, wanna do good, Boy Scout did an investigation, but India's premier organization, investigative organization, the CBI did the investigation. So there's no prosecution of perpetrators. Yeah. You name any number, I can give you a whole case. I maintain a database of the number of requests for data of prosecution, and it's just, it's like me rubbing my brass lamp and hoping a genie will come out and help me. I'm no prosecution. There is absolutely no issue of even taking disciplinary action which is public, in the public domain. I am told, and I've received formal replies from the Home Ministry, that disciplinary action has been taken against this second lieutenant for the issue of rape. What is disciplinary action? When I probe further, it's a demotion and a curtailment of salary and increments for 2 years. What is the minimum sentence for rape under the penal code? There's my answer. Nothing's happening. Nothing's happening. You saw the Gogoi case where you tie a human shield in front of a jeep and take him around the village, and the chief of defense staff gives a commendation to the officer, who's later on picked up for a molestation of a young underage girl, and the whole government winks at the subject, the earlier human shield and the subsequent molestation. I can give you any number of cases. I've sent it to the various bodies, bilateral and international. For the last 14 years, the EU has not had a bilateral meeting on human rights, which was earlier an annual feature. This year in January, it was supposed to be held. One day before the meeting, it was cancelled. No scrutiny for India. Thank you very much. We are a democratic country. We're open to everything under the sun. India intervenes wherever it's useful. And I agree with India's intervention so far. I agree with India's intervention in Bangladesh in 71. Otherwise, the Pakistani army was going berserk and killing thousands of Bengali intellectuals and activists. There's no doubt that an intervention was called for and necessary. And this is what preventive diplomacy was, the idea of preventive diplomacy as enunciated by Boutros Ghali was exactly this. Yet when it comes to other issues which are not conducive to India's global geopolitical interests, suddenly it gets an attack of laryngitis. It doesn't speak. Then we're looking for the Sphinx which never speaks. Then it made a very good intervention on humanitarian relief when even medicines were not allowed to go to north and northeastern Sri Lanka. And they sent in aircraft which sent in supplies because the ships were being interdicted on the high seas by the Sri Lankan Navy. Yet, we will not say a word when 100,000 Bhutanese refugees came into India. There is no contiguous border between Nepal and India, and we turfed these Bhutanese refugees into Nepal. Nepal being too weak to say anything, lumped it, hook, line and sinker. India did not like resolution number 3074 of the General Assembly in 1973, which talked about any war crime and in situations of conflict had to be prosecuted. That's why we were very unhappy when the ad hoc tribunal on Yugoslavia was brought forward in 1993 when the Security Council set it up. I was in Rome at the negotiating conference as part of a small NGO group, which was part of to advise the drafting committee. And I know how much India put effort into to make sure that none of the important clauses ever got in. Finally, it didn't sign it along with the United States. Yet you see the United States now on the back foot on a number of things, where the most recent of it, the International Criminal Court's prosecutors' position that it can prosecute Israel for what's happening in the occupied territories. You can see how in each and every area on human rights accountability, domestic or international, India has not risen to the bar. You can see that in the discussions. I attended it only for 4 years. I didn't attend it for 13 years on the UN declaration, not a convention, a declaration on human rights defenders. Look at the wording on Article 10 on the issue of funding and what is now bugging every single civil society organization in India, the issue of funding. The FCRA, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. India watered it down along with Egypt. Completely watered it down. And the Norwegian chair was so tired of these 14 years of negotiation that he just let it go through. And both the Indian diplomat and the Egyptian diplomat were masters at obfuscation. I know them both very well. We definitely had a drink every once in a while in the Serpentine Bar. But that didn't make us friends. So all I'm saying is that tell me where is accountability in India or in any part of South Asia, because we all inherited the old British laws on impunity, which were done in the 1935 India Act for the first time, because British colonial officers did not want to be prosecuted by Indians going to the House of Lords. They didn't have a similar law in Malaya. They did not have a similar law in Nigeria or Kenya. They knew that the Indians were smart Alex, good at law, and who would land up in London even if the federal court in New Delhi blocked it. So they enacted it in law in the 1935 Act. And we continued it after independence. It was so very convenient. The white Sahib went, the brown Sahib came in, And so accountability, please go out the window. What is it, this cultural relativism and keeping? We are a country which for 1,000 years has had 1,000 mutinies on issues of discontent and popular will. And Gandhi put it beautifully. I'll end here. Gandhi put it beautifully. Gandhi, the exact quote escapes me, but he said that all the windows and all the doors of my house are open. The good air wafts in, the bad air wafts out. No air throws me off my feet. A ready acceptance of good ideas, of good concepts from any part of the world. This government and the earlier government, and I take no political sides, a plague on both of them as far as accountability is concerned, as far as sovereign immunity being used selectively, extremely selectively used. You did not intervene in a number of issues there. Even on Fiji, when Rambuka took over Fiji, the Indians made all the right noises, but didn't do anything. It took New Zealand and Australia to lean on Rambuka and do the right thing. I know because I was very involved in the international solidarity for Fiji, working out of London. And so there's nothing sacrosanct about the Indian position. It needs to do a lot more. And the whole issue of accountability to Parliament is not there. All decisions on ratification, on reservations, on accession to international conventions is done by the cabinet. There's no open discussion. There's no open discussion. Parliament is completely oblivious to the consequences of what it means. So they sign on the dotted line. So we signed the Torture Convention because we were under a lot of pressure in the in the mid-90s, and we've forgotten to ratify it. And it's now 25 years since it was signed, and we are still waiting for Golo ratification. So I beg to differ from Mohan Gopal on this issue. I've got too much in my file cabinet on this because I've tried to pursue cases. Habeas corpus petitions not heard in Jammu and Kashmir High Court for years together. Habeas corpus petitions. The habeas corpus petitions pending of the Bhima Koregaon case. You find all the time in the world to hear petitions of industrialists, but have no time to hear a petition of an 80-year-old sick paraplegic. It's incredible, the accountability. Habeas corpus, where is habeas corpus? Tell me where is habeas corpus and I'll tell you what is domestic accountability. Preventive detention. Which other constitution in the world, apart from that earlier Mexican constitution of that crazy party called the Institutional Revolutionary Party? I don't know how they could come up with a name like that, Institutional Revolutionary Party. Shades of Trotsky. Even they revoked it. Preventive detention is a finite law. It has to be ratified by Parliament every few years. Now you cannot. The UAPA is a permanent law. It's no longer like TADA or POTA. You've made preventive detention for all practical purposes there. You're not able to use any of the CRPC, the criminal procedures in UAPA adequately. So I believe that there is a time once again to revisit international accountability. And I know the UN process is extremely slow. It may not happen in the near future, but already there are other things happening, which all of us need to be aware of. The US has enacted the Magnitsky Act, which allows for sanctions against individuals and governments and corporate entities. Canada has done so similarly, the legislation, and the UK has also done similar legislation. And recently, the European Union has also decided on putting similar legislation forward. And I am aware that Australia is drafting something similar. So accountability is not going to go immediately. It is going to be very slow, but it's definitely coming. You cannot be the Indian government acting like King Canute saying, please ask the waves to go back. Thank you. Any comments, any other questions on the earlier presentations or now?
Could I come in, Ravi, because you referred to me, and I was
Yes,
surprised by your reference to me, because I don't think I ever said that sorry, my video is off. My apologies. I don't think I ever said that we have strong and effective mechanisms of domestic accountability. Far from it. I work very closely with the system. I know extremely well that is very weak on our part. But I've also worked for many years in the international system, and I'm not going to pin my hopes on all these sanctions being visited on us by United States and United Kingdom and European Union. That's not realistic at all. So what we need to do is we need to strengthen, as one global sort of body of lawyers and law scholars, we need to strengthen the norms that apply to all these 100 sets of problems that have been identified in this book, which includes accountability, which includes arbitrary arrest and detention, which includes rape, which includes every one of the points that you said. And we need to work on how we can, on one hand, many of those instruments need to be strengthened. What can we do as students of law to strengthen those norms? And then what can we do domestically to rely on and bring those norms into our own courts? And you see, if our constitution gets overthrown, then my comments are irrelevant. If we are going to have an official Hindu Rashtra, my comments are irrelevant. But as long as we are in a constitutional republic, then we have to build our own arguments and expose the fact that this accountability is not there, build public opinion, move the courts, come up with new legal arguments. Many of our lawyers are doing now. And so we can work together and make sure that we strengthen accountability. Accountability is extremely weak. I also said, before I said anything about accountability, I said sovereignty should not be asserted by the government against its own citizens. The government must be under the rule of law. It's more than accountability. The government must be under the rule of law, not only in terms of the constitution and the statutes, but also in terms of jus cogens, peremptory norms, which are part of our domestic law, basic structure of the constitution. So my point is, if you want to give immediate relief to people, then we have to find ways of working with our institutions and getting them immediate relief. I'm too realistic and too much experience to be hopeful that international sanctions are going to change the behavior of obdurate authoritarian governments that have ruled us and continue to rule us. No, that's not going to happen. We have to strengthen, as we are doing, our own domestic institutions. That's what you've been doing. That's what I've been doing. But I never implied that we have a strong, framework of accountability at all.
I don't want this to be a mutual debate, but I just want to make quickly one or two points. Judge Albie Sachs once came to India on my invitation. This was years ago when he was a member of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. And believe it or not, the government cancelled the Constitutional Club booking that I had made at the last moment. So we had to shift using cabs, the whole audience that had come to the Indian Social Institute. But Judge Sachs made an important point, saying that if it wasn't for the Boycott South Africa campaign, the anti-apartheid movement, and the major sanctions that were initiated initially only by Sweden, but then caught traction thanks to people's solidarity movements across the world, they perhaps would have been under apartheid regime for a much, much longer period. The armed struggle, Umkhonto v Sizwe, was a joke. to put it mildly. Though, of course, much was made of it by the Soviet Union and East Germany, which were underwriting the costs of these boys in green in the bush. And just as an aside, we trained the officer corps in the Indian Military Academy, also and contributed to the armed struggle, which did not go anywhere. But the Swedish policy of apartheid sanctions forced Maggie Thatcher and Reagan, who were standouts, to finally toe the line, and that hurt apartheid South Africa. Now, second, on the trigger mechanism, just as a point of information, the OAU has a trigger mechanism that if an elected government is displaced by coup, then that country will be suspended from the OAU after an inquiry, and if it doesn't give a finite date for parliamentary elections and parliamentary rule to be reinstated, they would be expelled. Yet we see the example of many countries, Sudan, Egypt, and others who have completely flouted this general body resolution, which was at that point of time unanimously adopted by the OAU. So it's a question of, as Napoleon said when he displaced the Vatican, how many battalions does the Pope have? And clearly Egypt is a very powerful country militarily, and in North Africa it is the major power, and it today has the support of the West unflinchingly, because it technically displaced a Muslim Brotherhood government which was completely democratically elected. So there is a problem in this. The second issue is, how do I explain to anybody that I am a resolutionary? I am no revolutionary, otherwise I wouldn't be in human rights. I'm a resolutionary. I believe in the Constitution. But more and more, you can see that the Constitution and the avenues given in the Constitution are shut doors. How can you have the diminution of the elected government into a rump Bantusan by the union government in Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, not heard by the Supreme Court for 2.5, 3 years now? It has not had the time to hear a petition when it has the time to hear corporate interest petitions and Vodafone back taxes petitions in daily hearings. I ask myself, what is the priorities that the Supreme Court has, and what is the hope it gives to me that constitutional norms will be defended? On the issue of internet shutdowns in Kashmir, on the internet shutdowns in Delhi, on the issue of large number of under trials who are tribals in Chhattisgarh and Orissa, where their petitions are pending for years and years and years in the high courts, not in the lower courts, in the high courts and the Supreme Court. So I am all for using domestic mechanisms wherever possible, only on reasons of practicality. They're easier to access. They're easier to access. Making one alternate shadow report to the Human Rights Committee, it takes me 6 months of hard work along with a few staffers and interns. We can do a petition, and I have a petitioner in the Rohingya case, or the attempted deportation of Rohingya refugees. No further hearings. And only last week we pulled out refugees out of jail in Siliguri in West Bengal. And nothing's happened. So Rohingya refugees continue to be deported in spite of the petition. And I have a lawyer who's a super duper lawyer, Rajiv Dhawan, an academic and a lawyer, a well-known lawyer. And the other petitioner is Prashant Bhushan, who's no neophyte in fighting public interest litigation. Yet we have got nowhere with the petition. Nothing. And in the meanwhile, Rohingya refugees continue to be deported, even to a military junta. So I'm saying I'm all for domestic application, domestic access, domestic accessibility. But hello, I am outside the cave. I keep shouting and hollering, open sesame. There's no opening of the sesame. Or I sound more like Joshua blowing the trumpets outside the walls of Jericho, hoping they'll fall fast. So they aren't. So I'm speaking only from a practical point of view. Every day we are still. A high court judge tells a family whose person has been shot and killed in the Punjab, go and surrender in the same police station, and then we'll hear your case. What do I do? The case of Surinder Singh Fauji, still pending. And our former judge, before he was elevated to the bench, argued the petition on behalf of the victim, so Mr. Sodi. So I am all for, but the domestic access is not there, and ask any activist actually approaching the courts, not reading. There are NGOs who are rehashing stuff that other lawyers, activist lawyers, and NGOs do, not them, but lots of lawyers who, the Anand Grovers of the world, the Prashant Bhushans of the world, the KG Kannavirans before he died. There's lots of them, the Vrinda Grovers of the world, lots of them who are Indra Jaisinghs, who have some relief, but ask them how much relief have they got in major cases. Has Anand got any case in the relief in the Bhima Koregaon case? None whatsoever. He's there, he's fighting it out. But the government is very worried. Even a letter to a special rapporteur, which may not feature in the special rapporteur's annual report in 3 lines, embarrasses the government much more than a Supreme Court petition here. So obviously I will go to the special rapporteur's report, because a 2 lines report that he or she gives to the General Assembly is more embarrassing to the government than all the Supreme Court petitions I do. And I've seen it in so many places. The diplomats come to me and say, please, you need to rethink what you're doing on this issue. So they are not, and this is exactly why they are now stopping NGOs from going to international fora. The Priya Pillai is not the first person who was stopped. Tons of NGOs have been stopped from going, tribal activists, Dalit activists, activists from the Northeast. Khurram Parvez has been, in Kashmir, has been offloaded aircraft. It's happening all the time. So if you do not care about international scrutiny, then what's the concern? Let us go and yell and mumble and grumble in any international fora. If nothing else, if we don't get an international fora, I'll climb on a soapbox in Hyde Park. Why are you worried about some old fogies writing a letter to the House of Commons? So there is a certain embarrassment that the government of India, irrespective of the political party, feels. And if you are advancing human rights and the rights of the people, the most marginalized, who do not have voices, would the tribals displaced in Orissa against this British multinational Vedanta owned by a group of non-resident Indians ever succeed if it wasn't for the campaign in Britain? So that's what I'm saying. Didn't the Indian freedom movement benefit, and wasn't Roosevelt took it up with Stalin and Churchill, and an obdurate imperialist like Churchill at the Yalta conference because of the campaign of the India Independence League run by J.J. Singh in the US, or Krishna Menon in the India Independence League in the UK, who turned the whole Labour Party stance for Indian independence, because we must remember that until 1930 it was only the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, not the British Labour Party, which was supporting independence. It was Fenner Brockway and others who were campaigned by Krishna Menon who brought this. So international campaign has always been part of our freedom movement, has been part of our movement during the emergency. If it wasn't for the Socialist International, what would we have got? A voice here, or even the predecessor party of the BJP, and it sent Subramaniam Swamy to campaign abroad. It create the Friends of the Jansang in London, run by a minister, Hasmukh something, who later on became a minister in Gujarat. International campaign has been part of our thing. So I don't see suddenly this whole sovereign notion, sovereignty notion, we will fend off all intruders, deepen the moat, heighten the walls, and repel all borders kind of strategy by the diplomats in India and the Home Ministry bureaucrats. Water will permeate to the level it finds when there is a problem. And we need to acknowledge these problems, address them honestly, and put in mechanisms, legal and statutory mechanisms to address them. Then what is the National Human Rights Commission? It's a joke. Please read the 1993 parliamentary debates on the setting up of the National Human Rights Commission. Mr. Vittal Gadgil, who was also, apart from being was also a Congress spokesperson, for once confessed on the floor of the House, saying that this is a buffer against us and international scrutiny. That was the purpose of the National Human Rights Commission. That's not your best foot forward in terms of domestic accountability. That's definitely not your best foot forward on domestic accountability. To me, domestic accountability is the first step. But when domestic accountability does not work, I shall tap all doors which can give me succor. I better stop there, otherwise I can go on and on the subject. I'm sorry. If there are any others who would like to ask questions of any of the three panelists, please do so. And we need to wrap it up. So all of you have a quick last chance at the cherry.
Can I ask a question? This is Gopal.
Yeah.
Firstly,
Gopal is a lawyer in the High Court in Delhi.
I am grateful. I am not a big fan of modern technology, but if modern technology was not there, I don't think I would have got a opportunity today to hear all that which I heard from the so-called horse's mouth. And also, at the same time, I'm also grateful that I have come to know of this important work which has been put across to me today from the horse's mouth. A very great enterprise is indeed it is. And I understand when I got to know how many footnotes have been put and what it took to put these footnotes is just a matter of, not just a matter of imagination. I have practical experience that when one puts a proper footnote, what is the importance and value of this and how much work it may amount to. It is, I think, I personally feel I will try to read the book in bits and pieces only to begin with. It's a very lengthy book, I am told. And I think it is a treasure trove of tools which can be employed by those who are in this field to get something out of the system of law which we have enforced. I am sorry, I have not got the surname of the main speaker, so I will use a normal standard English expression, sir. I came in the field of law by accident. It was my choice. I was a mathematician, and perhaps if I had continued like that, I would have had a very comfortable and satisfying life till the last day of my life. I came here in this field out of my choice. My closest relatives and good wishers said, "My God, you don't know what is all law and practice all about." Then I said, "I want to see and know myself." They said, "Then be an academician. Don't go into practice of criminal law. You don't know what all happens there." I was adamant until date. I am adamant. And therefore, what happened is that I began the practice of law after I graduated in law at the trial court level, because I thought I want to know how is the system functioning today. And then I wanted to see what is it which I can do. I personally feel that the history of modern civilization is directly linked to how the issue of human rights have become important. At the same time, I also feel that in the last 80 years, 100 years, we have seen so much of development in each and every field, science, technology, health, everything. But at the same time, my personal opinion is that this issue is human rights being so very integral part of modern life. This issue is developing much more slowly and unsatisfactorily in comparison to various other aspects of life, which is directly affected to political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. My personal opinion is also that there is a direct correlation between human rights and human life, and this is an integral right. And I first just would point out that I think in India in 1984 December, the Bhopal gas tragedy, which saw suffering of large number of people in India, and it's how it developed and concluded. It gives me a very unsatisfactory feeling. I am an Indian. I would like to be proud of my country and my laws based on how the law are applied and what relief victims are able to get out of the system. My distinguished senior lawyers are practicing in High Court and Supreme Court, and I think they know what is the situation like. They are trying their best. I'm also sure that the judges who are sitting in the High Court and Supreme Court, many of them, they are very much interested that something ought to be done, and at times they are also giving relief, knowing that the establishment of the time is not happy when such a decision is given. However, I would like to point out that when sometimes some senior lawyer or person who is in the field says, Gopal, please take up this case. I take up at the trial court level, and this I would like to continue. But I would just like to point out at that level, when I take up a case, it was, I can give an example, in 86, after I joined the profession, 2 Dalits their human rights were thoroughly violated by the police in Delhi. And both were Dalits, they had no political affiliation, and they also had no support, but I took up their case, and because after I talked to them, both of them, they said, we will do whatever you tell us, please get something out for us in this, what has happened. I first went to the High Court and requested, let this matter be investigated by the police and let it be prosecuted by the state, because they are fighting against the police force and they are Dalits, they have nothing in their pocket. The High Court, for whatever reason, it was of the opinion that since we have a waterproof case and evidence, therefore we should present it in the trial court and take up the matter as a private complaint case, in which what happens under the law is that the burden of proof shifts to the victim. He has to prove, and everything has to be done by him, not by the state apparatus. I just would like to point out that I had these 2 witnesses who said, we will not go back and we will not accept any compromise, even if the officers are willing to say, you take this and stop the case. For 8 years, they came to every hearing which was there, but what could not happen was that not the evidence of one single witness was recorded in the entire proceeding. It is frustrating for me, but I am a professional. What I say, what about these 2 persons who were Dalits and who had nothing? What would it have amounted to them to wait and come every year, day after day of court hearing, and get nothing out of it if their evidence had not come on record? I say that by being an Indian, I am proud of Indian Constitution, and I feel that even the Supreme Court, in theory, there is a very balanced opinion that when it comes to serious violation of rights, apart from the punishment, compensation for the crime committed by officials of the government should be an integral part of justice, and I accept these judgments and I respect these judgments and also the judges who have said so. But I would like to know, because I am going to be in this field of law, and criminal law somehow happens to be integrally linked with human rights issues. Therefore, I would like to ask, sir, this rule of law is the necessary condition for the protection of human rights, as well as when it comes to getting remedy against violation of human rights. Therefore, I would like to ask, what is the effect of delayed justice, even in democratic setups where laws are perfect, they give a lot of scope to prosecute and get justice. The higher court judges are willing to accept it in principle that law should be like this, compensation should be an integral part. But what is the effect of delayed justice in democratic rule? This I would like to ask, sir. Thank you.
The name is John.
John Pache.
Surname, sir, I did not could not.
Pache, yeah. But the answer is very simple, as you probably remember. As the saying goes, justice delayed is justice denied. It is one of the essential elements of justice is ironically speed and adequate compensation and retribution, depending on the nature of the case. So I'm not familiar, but I'm not surprised that the criminal justice system is, for various reasons, very slow, and very often, unfortunately, that leads to denial of justice, even if you manage to get private criminal prosecution underway already. I think if I may take one opportunity, Dr. Gopal raised a very important point, and I must say I cannot disagree with his the trouble is that the way I understood it, Dr. Gopal is hoping or wishing or presuming that the cultural level among governments, the culture of justice, if you like, has reached such a stage that you can actually have a kind of trigger mechanism, as you described. My years in international forum shows me that the components of international human rights law are governments who represent states. The problem is that it's governments that take decisions, but they bind states, and the state is the overall concept, the sovereign body that is the state. I don't believe that the governments are sovereign as such. The state that is sovereign, but the government is the ruling group of people democratically elected, hopefully, to run the state. And with regard to Anand Grover's question about the availability of the book for students, I will check with OUP, of course, but I do know that OUP has put the book on their so-called collection of Oxford Specialized Authorities on International Law, OSAIL, and that is offered either free or for some money to libraries, university libraries mainly, and there students can access it for free. If the university has the SAIL subscription, then the book is there, and they can access the electronic version, which, frankly speaking, in many ways, has a lot of advantage. I use my electronic version for most things because it's an easy way of going through such a volume of information in a logical way. But anyway, I very dearly wish to have the chance one day to discuss in more detail the brilliant points made by Dr. Gopal on this. And I am moved by Dr. Gopal Ram's.
Sir, I'm not doctor.
Okay, well, you're an ordinary Mr. Well, I still may talk to you though.
Sir, I'm pleased that I have this opportunity.
Yes, that's quite all right. No, I'm just saying how I mean, real and impressive and provocative to me anyway are these reflections. And I don't know where we are with time, but I just wanted to get in a couple of expressions of sincerity and the brilliant, absolutely brilliant interventions I've heard today. And I hope that we will have the chance to we cannot just do away with Dr. Mohan's remarks, because they are very topical and very immediate, and of course Ravi's response. So I just wish we had time. Ravi, it's in your hands.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can I just a moment? I thank both of Sir, you and also Dr. Mohan Gopal. And he has already given a wonderful suggestion which can be caught by anybody, and it comes into focus. That your book, that it will be published in India by a publisher, and it definitely the cost of the book will come down, and the access of the book will also be to a larger number of people.
With
thank
pleasure.
you very much.
With great pleasure, really. That's the idea of the book.
Just on a point of information, Oxford University Press has closed its legal publications division in India. So if we'll have to explore something with the permission of Oxford in UK, or bring it under the academic series of OUP India. So that is something that OUP UK will have to consider.
Okay, well, maybe you and I can follow that up, because they're really necessary, I must say. Yeah.
Sorry, I went to the site of the Oxford University Press, and the access is available only to those who can log in and register students, perhaps. And this is a reference book. Therefore, probably Dr. Mohan Gopal would think whether how fast this book can be brought up as an edition in India, and the cost of the book will definitely come down because of
that makes so much sense.
That's right. So thank you very much. If there are no other points of clarification, questions, information, anybody else want to say something?
I just wanted to say that there is a vast audience of lawyers in the district courts who are not students but are hungry for legal knowledge, have lived very subsistence levels, but have tremendously entrepreneurial, tremendously energetic. I am trying in Trivandrum to create an informal constitution, an institute for constitutional advocacy in the lowest level courts to cover all the courts in this district to implement what I'm saying. Ravi referred to South Africa and all that. Today South Africa has huge human rights violation. There is no international forum that will give relief. We can't compare apartheid to what is happening in South Africa under the South African Constitution. You can't compare Krishna Menon and Indian freedom struggle to India, either South Africa under their constitution or India under our constitution. I think we must understand how the international system works. And so what I am trying to do is I have tried a lot to sensitize judges. It didn't happen before. To the importance of protecting constitutional rights at the lowest courts. Very happy to say that some recent Supreme Court judgments have reinforced that. And so we need to increase that consciousness. We need to create a bar, a human rights bar that at the lowest level in every court complex. We have about 2,500 court complexes. And there are hundreds of lawyers from very poor backgrounds, but qualified and very eager in each of these court complexes. So in one of these, I'm trying to create something called an Institute for Constitutional Advocacy. If those lawyers could have access even online to your book, it would make a huge impact. That's what I mean by saying ideas from at the global level can be very valuable inputs to improving arguments at the local level. Very valuable. They are really at a dead end to what arguments to make before a court, what precedents to cite. And so if we can improve the awareness and use of human rights ideas at that local level, I think that's the only, that's the first call and the best call of relief for local people. Even high courts and Supreme Court are too far away in our country. So I would agree that if there was some way that this extremely valuable work was produced could be made accessible to impoverished members of the bar, in other countries as well, it would have a huge impact.
Thank you. Anybody else? Otherwise,
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to make some points, Ravi.
Yeah, Sanjay, please.
I won't give a long talk.
No, please, Sanjay.
One is, I want to pick up on what Dr. Mohan Gopal said about the lower courts, because I think it's critical that you reach the large community of legal aid lawyers with knowledge about this. So we're really talking about legal aid education, legal education even to the lawyers on these issues, because whether it's Part 3 of the Constitution or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or whatever, how these are actually seamlessly connected. I think that is the point that needs to be established. And I think from his own experience at the judicial academies, that's a critical input. The other thing is the point that both Dr. Gopal and John had mentioned at some point, because the Human Rights Council, the commission before it, like many of the human rights institutions across the world, lacks teeth. It has no implementable powers. It can recommend, it can try to name and shame, etc., etc. But as Dr. Gopal said, these things become bilateral issues. And once they become bilateral issues, it's really very, very difficult to navigate out of that. So and this is not something that we can discuss here at any length, is how does the Human Rights Commission really get more teeth and relevance at a time of very strong nationalist leaders everywhere in the world? I'll stop there. Thank you. You don't have to answer the question, it's just the two.
No, just on a point of information, all states, including India, as part of the Vienna program of Declaration and Program of Action, were supposed to start a human rights education program nationally and create a national plan of action on this.
No,
we had one meeting. We had one meeting in India, and that was the end of Solomon Grundy.
I know this. That's why I'm raising it, because this has to be, the different generations have to take over now. Can't keep doing this
exactly
ad infinitum.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Ravi, there is also the International Coordination Center for National Human Rights Institutions, which is as effective as our National Human Rights Commission.
I'm aware of that. There's a major report on it by me on my website, and we know exactly how India got its present accreditation re-accredited. I don't want to go into detail.
These international institutions we know how they function very closely. I think Mr. Pache and I have been inside these institutions for a long time. And so we have perhaps a little more realism about them and how they function and what expectations we can have of them. I entirely agree with Dr. Hazarika that the challenge is how to bring knowledge to the local level. And I think, and I don't say this often, I say this very rarely, but I think this book produced by Mr. Pache, has huge potential. If it is available free online publicly, it can have a huge impact worldwide to lots of people at the ground level who now have access to the internet. To really be informed about what's going on. There are, as I said, about 100 areas of struggle on which global norms are brought together in this book. And at least 1,000 mechanisms, including international mechanisms. Now, we haven't even discussed, for example, the inspection panel of the World Bank, which has actually, I was there when it was created, and so on. So it has been quite effective in providing individuals a direct complaint mechanism within a framework. So my idea is, how do we provide remedies at the local level, effectively? And so I think this book, my fervent request is to make this as widely available as possible, free of cost, not only to students and universities, because only 5% of India's population has a bachelor's degree. And, the number of people who go to university is very small. So if you make this available widely and get it translated, it's a huge exercise, but if you can find it translated into Hindi, for example, or some local languages, I think it can have a massive impact. And, help us to be.
That's excellent. That's really worth pursuing, I must say. We need to really put our heads together, Ravi, and we take up because maybe as another reflection, more focused might help. Forget the book, but focus. Yeah, absolutely. This is 100% plus consistent with the whole aim of the thing. I agree with you, especially the translation.
No, it would be useful if Dr. Gopal could perhaps write a review of the book in the Hindu book supplement, and as you have access to the full copy, and I will encourage Anand to do a similar review in Bibliophile, which is bought by every library and librarian across India, all the academic institutions, and most of them decide on what to buy after reading Bibliophile or the Hindu book supplement. So perhaps reviews in both these two to start with, and perhaps some other journals, not so widely read by head librarians, but nevertheless read by heads of departments of law or law universities, would be one useful step forward.
I dare not.
That's excellent. That really is excellent.
I dare not say no to Ravi, but he won't let me off easy, as you have seen. So I don't have an option. I face Ravi's sanctions, which I take very seriously. Global sanctions. I take them very seriously.
Excellent, excellent.
Absolutely. I would encourage Mr. Pache to at least translate this into Hindi, if not to other Indian languages. Hindi, Tamil, the areas where human rights violations are the most is basically Hindi-speaking areas. And
I got
it
you,
would be wonderful. And if you can put it online, a Hindi version, that would be very powerful.
Gosh, you have a lot of work in the coming days, Ravi.
Yes.
Polish up your Hindi, Ravi.
No, my Hindi is pretty good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything. No,
you can
not
translate
that quality. Not that quality. I have enough Hindi to have the rabble storm the Bastille.
I have no doubt. I have no doubt.
We don't doubt.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to everyone, and to Dr. Pache, Dr. Mohan Gopal.
We did not hear from Mr. Shiraishi, if he wishes to say anything at all. So if he's still there, or
Osamu is a very dear colleague for the last 30 or 40 years. Osamu is there. He is. He's a great listener.
Well,
Oh, would you like to say something?
Not really. I'm overwhelmed by Indian curries.
Thank you, Osamo. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that I have a chance to listen to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, there's a curry shop in Yokohama started by a grand uncle of mine during the Second World War, because he was part of the Subhash Chandra Bose INA and he never came back to India. So you please visit it. It's now run by his family.
Osamo was very much involved in the Bangkok meeting and in the Vienna meeting.
That's right. Absolutely.
We were, we were responsible for the first special procedures, as you know.
Yeah, that's right.
We were in charge of the first. We're trying to form the way of investigation and so on, and so we did that for the first 10 years of their existence.
Yeah.
And we had to borrow the trusteeship council petition procedure to enable to legally justify the presence of people at the conference table of the United Nations. Otherwise, you could not admit a person in his or her name. And it is thanks to that breakthrough that we were able to do all these interviews by special rapporteurs and so on.
Yeah.
It's a privilege.
Long battle. Thank you so much again for everyone. Thank you, Dr. Pache, Dr. Mohan Gopal, Anand, all the other participants, Gopal, Sanjay Hazarika, Osamu Shirazi, and Anjali, who stayed on. I'm not aware of the others in the YouTube channel, but thank you also for tuning in on YouTube, and most importantly, to thank Dr. Mohan Gopal for the WebEx platform. Otherwise, we'd be again having to be faced with some hungering Indian dervishes.
You will be sending the recording, won't you?
That's right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. Thank you so much again, everybody.
Thank you.
Mr. Ram, take care. Thank you. Good luck with your cases. Bye-bye. Thank you. Ravi will talk soon, huh?
Very well. Very well. Thank you so much again. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you for everything.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. I'll speak to you later, Dr. Gopal.
Yes, of course.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Shall I